Happy Friday and welcome to Career Launch Live. I am your host, Catherine McCord, and I am insanely stoked about our guest today. You've heard me talking about him on the show before, and he's joined us today to talk about curiosity and inclusion. Let's bring on, without any further ado, Seth Butler. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
I am so excited. So we met, just to let the audience know, we met at HRDS, HR Disruptor Summit. It was a blast. Got to hear your spoken word, which was quite an experience, a new way to learn about inclusion. So tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Yeah. So, gosh, where do I start? I've been in higher ed for about the past 10 years. And so I recently made the jump to be self employed, travel and speak and do all of that. One of the things I'm really passionate about is just facilitating conversations. I don't like to say I lead them because I just like to open the door and allow people to talk, right? I like to facilitate conversations around just human connections, human difference, and belonging. And one of the ways in which I do that is I use poetry as a way to open the door and allow people to engage. And that's what I do now. I love it. I did that with students for a number of years, and they've really engaged with it. And now I get to go and take my talents on the road, if you will, to continue that type of conversation.
I love that. I do. And I love the career pivot because I've seen so many educators start to make these kind of jumps to other things in which they're brilliant. And so I love that background. And I feel like that might have given you some tools that
Sure.
help you best facilitate these conversations. Would you agree with that?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I still love academia and higher education. And I still work with folks. I still actually just had a dinner last night with somebody that's in the DEI world. But the tools you gain, the landscape of how things operate within higher ed is invaluable. And it's stuff that I'm able to reference even though I've been gone for about 6, 7 months now.
It kind of sticks with you, I
It
think.
does. Yeah,
Once you've done it, it kind of just sticks in there.
it
So
really
I
does.
wanted I was so excited to have you today because the curiosity and you kind of put um, terminology and an actual theology behind this kind of feeling that I've always had about how I would love to see things done, and you really hit home about the curiosity element of it, of
Mm.
diversity and inclusion, which I think a lot of and as after your presentation I started realizing that a lot of the organizations that I'm seeing fail, it's because they're not embracing the curiosity element. So
Mhm.
I would love to have you just kind of give us an explanation to start the conversation off about what what we're talking about and kind of what your theory is and your way of approaching DE and I.
Yeah. So one of the things that I noticed during my time in higher ed, I tremendously value diversity, all the differences that make us unique. And that's why I got into kind of that world. And one of the things that allow us to explore the differences is just by asking questions and follow-up questions, and then even providing pushback. And like, I think there's healthy tension to be had within the exploration of different identities and worldviews. Um, and unfortunately, I did not see that happen a ton throughout my time in higher ed, because it was more of like, this is the right way, this is the wrong way, this is the right identity, this is the wrong identity. And that began to show up in the classroom where um, things that students wanted to say, questions that they wanted to ask, they were bottling up. And I would draw it out of them like, why don't you guys want to talk about this? Well, because I don't want to be painted as a bigot. Oh, well, what? And I don't want to talk about it because, like, I've hurt someone before because I don't know how, and so it's easier
Right.
for everybody just to stay silent. And so as I began to see this, like, my philosophy was like, no, we should be able to curiously engage with each other, and there will be hiccups and there will be offenses, hopefully that they're unintentional. But if we lose the ability to ask questions, we lose the ability to connect with the human difference that we each hold, which is the whole point of
Yes.
being in the
Yes.
DEI field. And so
Right.
that's kind of like my main approach is like, I want to be curious. I want to ask questions, even hard questions, to get to know you.
Right. Yes. And I want to be specific. So we're not saying that you should just run up to a person of a different identity and go, "Hey, I have all these questions for you." Right. That's
Right,
that's
right.
awkward and it's made up it may be a little bit uncomfortable.
Do not
Um
advise that.
yeah,
Yeah.
do not advise that at all. Um, but in the appropriate setting, and hopefully and I think it's always great to start with a facilitator, such as yourself, to come in and just kind of be there to make sure the psychological safety is there and that type of thing. I think it's a brilliant approach. It's an absolutely brilliant approach. And I started implementing this recently with a client of mine,
Mm,
and to see the difference now and how they all speak to each other and how they'll communicate because now they understand where they're coming from.
mhm,
It's made such a difference in the culture of the company and in their inclusion. It's
mhm,
really wonderful. So I want to start with, first of all, the question that I get a lot when I mention curiosity is, well, what about the people in whatever marginalized group that are exhausted and they just don't have the energy to give those answers right now? What's your
mm.
response to that?
I think that's valid, 100%. And my caution to those folks would be the way in which we respond also matters, because I've seen this done where unfortunately it has been done before in somewhat of a hostile way, where it's just like, you know, you need to educate yourself. Um,
Yeah.
you know, you need to go read a book. Like, don't come at me with this and this. And then it kind of breeds this tension where my advice, if you are exhausted, I have been exhausted. After George Floyd, that whole weekend, the amount of phone calls that I got and students that I talked to and all of these things, my response was like, listen, like, this is really important. I want us to continue to engage in this. I need time to process myself. And
Yeah.
so don't my advice is like, don't necessarily attack the other person for their natural curiosity when they're trying to learn, but you can just let them know where you are personally without projecting your anger upon them. Like, hey, I just need space, and here's someone else that like I would refer you to. Keep the dialogue open rather than shutting it down, and
Yes.
you'll see a world of difference in how that continues.
100%. And I have seen, and I want to give a little bit of grace to some of the aggressive responses because there are those days, especially if
Yes.
you work in the field, that you're
Oh
like,
yeah.
God dang it, can't you just know something or get on some Google or something? But so I want to give grace to that because I do understand it. Trust me, I
Mhm.
personally relate. But it is very important. And also, one of the things, and I like that you made the point of here's this person I would refer you to, because I like to guide the sources. Because if you just Google or if you just
Mhm.
grab a book, who says it's actually a good book?
Mhm.
Or one that's actually inclusive or one
Mhm.
that, you know what I mean? So so I do like to kind of control the source a little
Yes.
bit. So I will
Yes.
send people to specific resources. And I actually just have, because for those days where I am mentally exhausted talking about neurodiversity, physical diversity, whatever else,
Mhm.
gender diversity, sex diversity, is I have a list of resources that I can just copy paste to people when this
Mhm.
happens
Mhm.
because I'm too tired and I just can't do it. And it has a very polite message to it because, and I had to do this when I was in a good place because when I'm
Mhm.
not, I can't I can't be that polite. So
Yes.
so I typed it up when I was in the right headspace and now I can just copy paste it to
Yes.
people.
Yes. I
But you
love
do
that.
it does change because then I've had those people circle back to me and have a
Mhm.
completely different mindset and a whole new set of knowledge because
Right.
they started going down the rabbit hole.
Mhm.
Um, and so I think that is very important. So when you're so let's say you're in that space and you want to have those conversations. What are some of the ways to ensure that you're having psychological safety and that you are being vulnerable and keeping everything kind of on track? I know it's kind of a lot in
Mhm.
one question, but how do you kind of just keep it on track and keep the psychological safety going?
Yeah. So I usually just lead with like my own level of vulnerability first as a way to kind of set the tone. And I have found, like, even just in my personal life, outside of like diversity and inclusion related conversations, that if I let them know, like, hey, I'm willing to kind of share my heart and share my life with you, as hard as it might be, and as complex as some of the issues might get to. I want to do that for the sake of learning and growth. So I usually lead off that way, and because the tone that I set, it's typically mimicked. They're like, "Oh, thank you for sharing that. I appreciate you sharing, that racialized experience that you had." And then they're able to ask some questions because I've said like, listen, there's not anything that you're going to say that's really going to offend me. I have thick skin, and for the sake of your learning, when I'm in that good headspace, for the sake of your learning and your growth, fire away, because
Right.
we don't often have a space where you can just ask questions like that just pop into your head. And so when I do that, usually it's reciprocated after a little bit where I'm able to ask a question. So tell me about why you asked that question. Like what was going through your mind? Like where do you think that came from? And then we get into some of like maybe some biases or stereotypes that might have had, and they're able to openly acknowledge it. And then all of a sudden we're having this conversation where we're debunking myths about certain identities. And it's really beautiful when it happens. But I usually lead with like myself first and say, listen, I'll put myself on the chopping block just to let you know that I'm not going to attack anybody, and this is the type of conversation I want to have. And when that happens,
Yeah.
it usually goes well.
It does. It really, really does. I've started, in fact, you saw me do it. I'll start almost every presentation with these are my diversities. These are the things I have going on. In
Mhm.
fact, we had the unique experience. This doesn't happen every time I'm on stage or presenting or teaching, where I was actually able to say, you may have noticed that over the last 24 hours, I've started to get more and more energy and more excited about things. And here's why. And we kind of got to talk about that and what some of you had witnessed, in my changes, and people that know me and were like, wait a minute, why is it all of a sudden like you're on cocaine or something? Like what's going on?
Right.
And I'm referring to my mania for those that don't know. So it is, I think that's so important because it does set that stage for more honesty, more people
Mhm.
to be able to have those types of conversations. But I also want to mention ego defense, because this
Mm.
is a thing that I've really come to talk to people about a lot, is that it is a natural thing for your brain to throw up these defenses, right? It's
Mhm.
that's what your brain does, is it doesn't want to be wrong. So it hears something and immediately wants to argue with it.
Mhm.
But if you come at it from a point of curiosity, and if you start teaching your brain, and it doesn't take very long, by the way,
Mhm.
teaching your brain to be curious instead and to ask questions about that, and
Mhm.
to stop, take a deep breath and say, okay, tell me about that. Tell me
Mhm.
why you asked that. Tell me. It sets a whole new tone.
It
And your
does.
mind just starts to expand and grow in ways you never thought
Right.
at
And
all. So tell us a little bit about how you do that.
yeah, I mean, I use myself as an example a lot, and it's interesting that you say like if we're able to ask questions. And unfortunately, what I've seen, the students that I would work with, like these incoming first year students, when it got to the point where you could look at them, you know that they're curious, you know that they want to ask questions. Usually, I would say, "What's holding you back?" And then that would open the floodgates of somewhere along the way, whether it's in education, whether it's societal, whether it's social media, I don't know for sure. Somewhere along the way, the ability and the comfort level for people to ask those questions has been suppressed to the point where they're saying, I do have a question, but I have valid reasons for me not to engage. And
Right.
so the way I get people to engage by asking those questions is I attack that head on. And I'll just say like, it it's going to be awkward and there are questions. And I acknowledge like just the reality of when we look at the culture around us, we're not doing this. It's not being modeled to us. What is being modeled is cancel culture, where if you ask a genuine question that someone or a group doesn't like, you get blasted. I was like, we're not going to do that here. And so I attack that head on and let people know that, hey, I know the dynamic that's maybe hindering you from talking. Let's address that, get that out front. And then now let's work through where do we want to be on the other end of this conversation. And when I address it head on, the tension in the room is like, "Oh, yes. So I can ask this question." And then when I do that, like, "Can you just, like, give me your viewpoint on, like, what's the difference between all lives matter and Black lives matter and white lives matter?"
Right.
Because I've not been able to have a conversation with anybody about that. I'm like, "That's great. Let's talk." So those are the types of things that come out when you address that head on.
Right. Absolutely. And I'm sorry, I'm just throwing up some of the comments that we're getting
Yeah,
of
yeah.
what of people's experience here. So and I loved um it's so very important as you're having these conversations to, I'm sorry, my brain just stopped. It was there. I had a thing to say, and then it just it just went whoosh, not going to be there anymore.
Yeah.
My brain
Happens to
just
me all the
stopped.
time.
I don't know.
Yep.
It happens. Inclusion. What can you do? So, but I will say, um, one thing that always sticks out when I hear you speak is that you're coming from a standpoint of, I want us to understand each other, and I want to educate, and I
Mhm.
want to connect. And I think that's what we really need to be focusing on, is the ultimate goal.
Mhm.
Because when I'm in that negative mind space and I need to still deal with something, it's not really optional. Maybe it's with a
Mhm.
client.
Mhm.
That's how I've learned to refocus myself, is what's my ultimate goal?
Right.
How do I get my brain to go back to that positive space
Right.
and to go back to that? And it's that goal.
It is, and, like, it's interesting you mentioned, like, wanting to connect. That's my mind frame. It's like, I and this it might come off, from a standpoint of arrogance, and I'm okay with that, but I believe that I can connect with anybody. Even people who are vastly different, because there's so many similarities that we refuse to acknowledge, or that we've been told not to acknowledge, that it significantly hinders our ability to connect. Whereas
Yes.
connection doesn't always mean agreeing on 100% of all of your identities, or 100% of all your viewpoints. I had a colleague, when I took this role at UF a number of years ago. I was going to go meet with, a faculty member, and a colleague of mine said, "Oh, well, they voted for so and so." And I was like, "Oh, okay. And you're still going to go meet with them?"
Yeah.
"Yeah." "Why?" "Well, because, like, we're gonna do this thing together, and I want to get to know them a little bit, and I want what we're going to do together to go well." And so what we have done is, we are so focused on our differences, our polarizing differences, right? That we've lost either the value, or we've lost sight of the ability to still connect despite some of those things that seem to divide us. And I had a lovely conversation. We did the project well together. And that is what's so debilitating for these students coming in. That's what's being modeled, right?
Right.
And it's just heartbreaking, because, many good friends in my life, I don't agree with some of their worldviews. I don't agree. We're not on the same page of how we navigate our lives. And yet we always meet with a hug and a kiss, and leave with a hug and a kiss,
Right.
because there's value to be had despite being, on 100% the same page, right?
Right. And I do tell, and I do, oh, I remember now what I was going to say, and it ties into what you just said. So that kind of works. So, and anybody who reads my post, watches my show, anything like that, will know that the part of cancel culture with which I firmly agree is that there can be a time to cut it off and go, okay,
Hmm.
no, you are just gross and you just need to go away.
Yes.
No, thank you to this.
Yes.
And then I do believe it's part of the selection process for people to go, okay, you have said or done something overtly. And I mean,
Hmm.
like when it's overt,
Hmm.
overtly
Hmm.
gross, we don't want to do business with you. That's fine. I feel like
Hmm.
that's a natural selection process, and that's fine.
Yep.
That's my opinion. But in general, in order to further the greater good and in order to
Hmm.
further your own relationships, it's so very important to look past certain things or to help educate. For instance, I have a lot of clients and they'll call me, oh, this person did this or that was racist. And you hear it, you go, okay, this might be a
Hmm.
misunderstanding. And not a
Correct.
misunderstanding like it wasn't racist, but the person may not have realized
Yep.
why it was or why it was sexist or
Yep.
this type, and they should, granted, but they don't. So you have to help and educate and that type of thing. And so
Mhm.
you do have to have some of that patience, right?
Mhm.
And give some of that grace. And then distinguish the line too between political and opinion and ethics.
Mhm.
Those are very different things. And I see people all the time confuse them.
Mhm.
Like
Mhm.
political views are not the same as ethical views.
Correct.
Not
Yep.
same thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I have a very dear friend, and she's as Republican as one can get. It
Mhm.
just like all the way Republican. One of the best humans that I know. And so while I'm not Democratic either, but while I'm not full blown Republican, and
Right.
there's definitely some political things that we don't agree on,
Right.
she's a fantastic human. And
Mhm.
she has those open conversations,
Yep.
right? Where we will
Yep.
sit down and she'll be like, I don't get it. Why is this a thing?
Yep.
And I'll tell her, and we just have that conversation. So I love that you're hitting on that psychological safety and the furthering, even when there is a difference.
Mhm.
because you're not going to agree with everybody. And would you want to? Would you want everyone to be the same?
No, absolutely not. And the thing that's
It'd be
so
boring.
debilitating about that is, and I don't know what appropriate terminology to use, but it's this notion of like this singular identity reduction that we do. We take all of a human being and then we reduce them down to a singular identity marker. Oh,
Ooh,
they're Republican.
yeah.
Oh, they're Democrat. Oh, they're racist. Oh, they're this, they're that, or they're whatever. And it's just like that. I just call that emotional and intellectual laziness, that you don't want to put in the
Oh,
work that's required to get to know and understand somebody else. And it's much easier. Again, it doesn't require that much work at all. Like, oh, I know this box that they have checked about their life. I know that they voted this way. So now I'm going to shove all of their humanity into that box. And then my interactions are dictated by that box that they're in, refusing to acknowledging that there's other parts of them that operate outside of
yes.
that box. And it's just like it's really debilitating to friendships and ability to connect. And so, but that's what we see all the time.
Constantly,
Yes.
constantly. And to your point, one of my favorite examples of that is when people hear Al Capone, they think murderer, they think gangster, all these things that they see very negatively. But what they miss is that when the Great Depression hit, he opened up a soup kitchen to feed all the people that didn't have jobs any longer. What they miss is that his son had severe autism, and he was an excellent father to him and supported him and worked with him. They miss that other element. So yeah, he did these things that we probably would have been better off if he didn't do them. But but he did these other things too. And that's kind of an extreme example,
Hmm.
but it does feed into the point of people have multiple parts of themselves,
Hmm.
right? And so you
Hmm.
have to get to know the full human to have the
Hmm.
all-encompassing part. I
Yep.
like the emotional laziness, emotional mental laziness.
I'm sorry. I just like to
It's
call
true.
it what it is. It takes work to
It
get to know
is.
people, and sometimes just people don't want to put in the work because they're intellectually or emotional lazy.
And it's not that hard. It's
No,
really not.
no.
It's not.
Smile at
It's not that hard.
somebody, crack a
Yeah.
joke, connect with them, like,
Yes.
but that takes work.
Yeah, it does, especially when you're not in the best mood that day.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's it's so funny with this type of work. I hear people all the time, oh, well, shouldn't you be this way or shouldn't you say this way?
Mm.
No. Everybody, even in this line of work, is going to be different, is going to be an individual, have different approaches. And that's beautiful. For
Mhm.
instance, Sharon Hurley Hall, who is one of my favorite inclusion human
Mhm.
beings, she's absolutely magnificent. She has such a peaceful and fantastic approach and very patient. And she's the one that taught me the idea that instead of saying white privilege, she says unearned advantage.
Mhm.
That's her terminology that she uses. And then Future Kane, same thing, man. That lady is always keeping me on the,
Mm.
keep love in sight, all that kind of thing. And then you got to have the people that are angry about it, right? To help fight that battle. And it just gets super irate about it.
Yeah.
In fact, I've seen Tara in the comments, and she's one of my favorite people who is a loving and caring human,
Yeah.
but she will just call it how it is and just put it out there
Yeah.
if you're
Yeah.
being gross. And she will educate you. She will take that time, but she'll also call you all your nonsense very overtly.
Mhm.
And I feel like you need a little bit of everybody. What are your thoughts
100%.
about that?
No, I agree because again, because we're all individuals and we all respond differently. There are some people who need a little of that tough love, right? And there are others who need a more soft approach, a more peaceful approach. And so that's why I think the individuality and the personalities that we all bring to the work matter, because I know I'm not going to be able to move the needle with everybody. I just know I'm not,
Right.
because not everybody is going to like the way that I talk, like the way that I facilitate conversations. That's not something that I have the ability to do, you know, on a wide scale. So the people that are going to respond to me, I'll work with those people, but I'm not going to try to be everything to everybody. And so that's why, like, why we need a referral network. Like, I know a little bit about how you operate and where you're coming from. I think Catherine McCord is going to be the person that's going to be more effective in helping you than me. And so I think self awareness really matters, of knowing how you operate so that you can let people know ahead of time, This is the way that I do things. So they can make the decision, like, I'm not going to respond well to that. And you can be like, okay, cool. Somebody else is going to be, better suited to meet the needs and kind of the common goal that we have in mind.
Absolutely, 100%. In fact, I've had to do that a few times. I've had to hand
Mm.
off speeches or anything like that. And the one that still just baffles me the most is that SHRM, the Society for Human Resource
Yeah.
Management, for those that don't know, had me come speak. And I was like, have you heard me speak? Really? Have you read my post? Are you sure? Are you sure about this? And they
Yeah.
did. They still went with it, but I was very surprised because like I'm very out of the box and all this. That's not really your jam, but okay, all right. And
Hmm.
we did it and it
Hmm.
worked. It was great. I've actually been invited back, which was cool. But it was so sometimes also again with the assumptions, don't assume. Let
Hmm.
them tell you
Yep.
what they're up for. Because I see that a lot in DEI work too. People will assume, oh, I'm not going to be the right fit. And I'm like,
Yep.
don't do that. You never know.
Yeah.
Maybe they're trying to really go outside the box.
Yep.
So before we wrap up, I wanted to ask you about this because we're talking about the importance of education and curiosity and these
Hmm.
types of things.
Hmm.
This is going to be slightly political, but I actually don't mean it to be. I'm just referencing a
That's okay.
situation that's going on. So in Florida, if you haven't noticed,
Mm.
our government has been limiting what schools can
Hmm.
teach, even in terms
Hmm.
of history,
Hmm.
in terms of diversity and inclusion. They are
Hmm.
really limiting what you can teach. How do you, I mean, to the point that, and I'll just say this honestly, I was just at a presentation and they were talking about how they wish they could have somebody come in and do something specifically about race. I recommended you and they said, oh, we can't. It's actually
Mm.
against the law.
Hmm.
How do you feel things like that, policies, even if it's not a law, a policy, things like that, stunt inclusion and
Hmm.
stunt coming to a peaceful place where we all understand each other and we can all move forward? Or does it?
Yeah. Well, I know I do think it hinders productive conversations because by not talking about it, we're not going to grow. And by not talking about it, then like people are still going to land at a certain conclusion about whatever topic it is, whether it be race or
Right.
gender or whatever that you try and limit. And so for me, I have the mindset of like we should have an open communication about controversial topics so that hopefully you you're not going to win on the extreme sides, but everybody in the middle, like the bell curve, you pull them closer together towards a common ground. And we don't have the ability to do that if we're not talking to the masses and allowing us to really work through some of these things. So I don't necessarily agree with the the stance that we should just shut everything down. Because at what point do you reopen it up, right? And
Right.
then by that point, there's already going to be some both conscious and unconscious socialization that has happened. So then it's like, okay, now we're ready for that conversation at this point. Well, it might be too late. Now we might have lost some of those people to the extremes because we weren't
Right.
conscious enough and intentional enough to be productive. And I think that's the key is I think where we are right now, I don't honestly don't know how productive some of the work is because when kids are coming in saying, I asked this question and then I got attacked as being racist. And then it's just like as you get to know the person, you're like, well, this person is racist, they're ignorant, they don't really know, but they don't have a bad heart. They're not there's no ill
Right.
intent there. But then that person shuts down and they never talk again. So that is, I think, kind of an extreme response that we see in Florida is that you have all this stuff coming. It's like, well, it's all of it's bad. There's all these bad repercussions. So let's just shut it down altogether. I don't think that that's right.
To your exact point, it doesn't. It just causes further problem and further breakdown. So thank you. So we're kind of towards the end of our show. So thank you so very much for joining us. I think this is one of the most critical conversations that we can be having right now to really help people understand really any matter in their life that needs
Hmm.
that needs help and about that they're curious, but especially when it comes to inclusion. I think this is so
Right.
very important. So as we say goodbye, what are some of your parting words of wisdom for those who are curious and do want to further these conversations at work or at home?
Yeah. I think you know this, but I live by kind of a model of growth and grace where we all need to grow in a multitude of areas, personally, professionally, societally. But we all need to be both recipients and demonstrators of grace. because no one is ever exactly in the same place of life that you are in your understanding, your skills, your operation. And so if we can seek to grow, but that if we can seek to give grace to people, and if we seek to give grace to ourselves and receive grace from others when we're in the wrong, I think we're going to be in a much better place.
I completely agree. And with that, thank you again so very much for joining us,
Thank
Seth.
you.
Connect to Seth on LinkedIn. Definitely have him speak. Invite him to come speak to your company. Trust me, you will enjoy the experience. It's a very unusual, fun, and engaging experience. So thank you again. Connect to me if you have questions as well. Be great, and remember, stay curious. Happy Friday, everybody.
Thank you.